Is a hot dog a sandwich? What about a taco? Is a hot dog a taco? Have you ever changed how you speak for an interview? Does your hometown accent come out more when you get excited? Have you ever wondered if American regional accents are all becoming more alike due to radio, TV, and social media? Why do many Black Americans speak with a different accent than their white counterparts from the same cities? Why do some seemingly make grammatical mistakes, and what, if anything, should be done about it? What connects all these questions? This is going to be a slightly different video than my usual, and it's about one of the greatest linguists of all time, an absolute genius who single-handedly invented multiple modern scientific disciplines. And you've probably never heard of him. Today, I'm going to talk about Bill Labov and all the different ways he radically changed how we think about language, race, and culture. I'm also going to tell a lot of very spicy stories about linguistics and linguists that I've been keeping quiet until now, so there's something for everybody. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I have a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm a language lover and language learner who makes content on YouTube about language and culture. Today, we're talking about Bill Labov. I'm sad to be making this video because I'm making it in the memory of my mentor and advisor. Bill Labov, may his memory be for a blessing, was a giant who literally invented sociolinguistics and modern discourse analysis and narrative studies. He pioneered new approaches to teaching literacy to speakers of non-standard dialects. He was among the first to study Black English and recognized that it has a consistent grammar different from classroom English. Not only did he co-author the Atlas of North American English, which maps regional variation in American accents, but he once saved the life of a man accused of having planted a bomb through his knowledge of regional vowel systems. He interviewed thousands, probably tens of thousands of people to better understand accents, and along the way developed a system for eliciting powerful stories which led to a new approach to understanding narrative. Bill Labov can tell you at what point a cup becomes so wide most people think it's now a bowl. Oh, and he also cultivated generations of scholars, including from, quote, non-traditional backgrounds, and seems to have made a positive impact on almost everyone he met. He relentlessly pursued knowledge, but used that knowledge to change people's lives for the better. From saving lives to improving literacy education to literally defending his students from politicking and false accusations. More on that in a minute, by the way. This is going to be equal parts linguistics and stories about the drama and politics and backstabbing of the field of linguistics. I have a personal connection to Bill, and I'm deeply mourning his passing, even though I hadn't seen him in a few years, and he was 97 and living with Parkinson's, and this was not unexpected. Bill is, simply put, the reason I am a linguist. Not just the inspiration, but the real-world, brass-tacks, rubber-meets-the-road reason. Bill Labov quite literally handpicked me and ensured that I could study under him, and stuck around at Penn past when he could have retired to mentor me and others he was already teaching. He could have just enjoyed retirement, but he co-chaired my dissertation committee, coming back to proudly sign his name on a dissertation that in some places flatly, definitively disproved assertions he himself had made years earlier. And he was excited to do it because he was committed to the truth, not his ego. I went to visit Bill Labov and my other advisor, Robin Clark, before applying to Penn, and we spent the better part of an afternoon together. He asked me what I was interested in pursuing and was excited to hear my ideas. My ideas? At the time, I was an untrained neophyte who just had an interest in things. I didn't even have an undergraduate degree in linguistics. It was East Asian Studies. There's two things that I will never forget about that first meeting. First, he showed me a graph and asked me, "What do you make of this?" And I thought it was a test, and I was about to fail it because I had no idea what to make of it. Goodbye, grad school. You can't even answer a simple question from a professor at the department you want to study in. Ashamed, but honest, I told him, I'm sorry, I really don't know. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Me neither. We can't figure it out." He was willing to talk to anybody and to respect anybody and solicit input from anybody in his quest to get at the truth. Second, he told me he had written a book to aid in literacy efforts in Philadelphia, especially among Black public school children. He pulls out the book and shows it to me. The main character is a rambunctious little girl named Taylor Jones. No joke. Maybe it was that coincidence alone that led to his selecting me, but when Tony Kroc, we had a turbulent relationship and he once called me illiterate. When Tony sorted my application into the reject pile, Bill and Robin took it back out. Like I said, he literally handpicked me as his last student, like with his actual hands. For that reason, I feel like I have a profound debt to him and to carrying on his memory and his mission. He told me in our first meeting not to pursue a traditional academic career in a linguistic department after the PhD, and insisted that I'm capable of more out in the world. No shade for those who went the traditional route. They're doing important and meaningful work too. But Bill Labov is part of the reason I use my skills to work as an expert witness, where I've helped save people's livelihoods and fight to keep people out of jail. He's the reason that I've taught dialect awareness and language processing to transcriptionists and court reporters. He's the reason that I'm serious about linguistic outreach and making linguistics accessible for the general public. Because he loved the general public. He hung out with the general public, pastors, gang members, and everybody in between. So his early life is absolutely wild. Bill was delivered by William Carlos Williams. You know, this is just to say I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox. That William Carlos Williams. He ate the plums for breakfast and then evidently went and delivered Bill Labov. Bill went to Harvard and studied chemistry and originally worked in industrial chemistry. He designed some printing inks that are still used to this day, evidently. But he went to Columbia and did graduate work in linguistics and completely revolutionized linguistics after that. Approximately the same time that Chomsky was dragging philology into the 20th century by applying mathematics, especially graph theory, and the fledgling field of computer science to linguistics, Bill was making the discovery that what had been called free variation and written off as meaningless up to that point was actually the impact of the social world on linguistic forms. In 1966, he published a master's thesis where he'd interviewed people on Martha's Vineyard and demonstrated that their orientation toward or away from local life was strongly correlated with how they pronounced certain vowels. After that, he did his PhD on the social stratification of English in New York City. That ultimately became this book. The basic finding, tremendously oversimplified, is that how we speak is determined by where we grew up, our age, race, level of education, and socioeconomic status, and also by who we're speaking to and how we want to be perceived. It's not just all noise, and you can't just abstract away from the social world if you want to analyze language effectively. We navigate all of these things, both above and below the level of consciousness, and we have what Bill referred to as a sociolinguistic monitor. When we talk, we're thinking about how we're being perceived and how we want to be. A hugely famous study was one in which he went to 3 different department stores, one upscale, one mid-market, one downscale, and he asked where to find an item he knew was on the 4th floor. He was interested in New Yorkers dropping our R's, and those words have R at the end of a syllable, both before more stuff, fourth, and at the end of the word entirely, floor. What he found is that everybody said 4th floor to a certain extent, and everybody added R's when speaking carefully after he asked, I didn't hear you, where? But also, the middle-class department store had clerks who were doing more social work by trying to avoid the socially stigmatized local variant, that is, dropping their R's, as a sort of face work related to potential social mobility. So that's 1968. In 1970 and 72, he published a bunch of work that came out of interviews in Harlem, where he was interested in how black folks speak. He published The Logic of Non-Standard English, as well as Language in the Inner City, and demonstrated that there is a coherent, systematic logic to how black folks speak. It's not all mistakes. Ignorance of these rules actually caused well-meaning white teachers to penalize black students rather than teach them effectively. For example, there are highly systematic rules of consonant deletion and syllable codas. To take one specific example, P, T, and K can be deleted after another consonant in a syllable coda if the consonant is also unvoiced, like P, T, and K are. So desk and test might be pronounced des and tes. If you're a teacher teaching pre-literate kindergartners and first graders how to read, and you use an exercise where you ask the kids to come up with words that rhyme, des and tes are not wrong. The kids are showing a high degree of phonological awareness that can and should be scaffolded to teach literacy. But on top of characterizing some of the phonological and syntactic rules of Black English, he also published on the social side of things, including a paper with one of my absolute favorite titles of all time, The Linguistic Consequences of Being a Lame. In case anybody's wondering, the other favorites are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal, which was a study that found that identical resumes got startlingly different and statistically significant response rates, depending on the name at the top of the resume and the race and socioeconomic class those names implied or suggested. And The Lexicalist Hypothesis, Both Wrong and Superfluous, which is a delightful paper with a great title. But I digress. One of my favorite parts about Bill's work on lames is that he straight up says, as early as the abstract, that most linguists are big fucking dorks and they need to learn how to be less dweeby if they want to be effective at their job. Not in those exact words. That takeaway seems lost on many, including many of his proteges, but it's right there. And honestly, it's borne out by who some of the most successful sociolinguists after him have been. The giants in the field tend to be gregarious and kind, just as comfortable talking about high school wrestling or jazz or whatever as about phonology. So, gregarious Bill interviewed thousands upon thousands of people because he was interested in their speech. And he used cutting-edge technology like the reel-to-reel tape recorder. Don't laugh, that was brand new. And the spectrogram, which had just been declassified. And you know, doing statistics. He had the genius idea of counting both when something happened and also when it could have but didn't, and doing statistics on those. Statistics! Wild stuff. And he had a bit more of an edge than people think. That reel-to-reel tape recorder, he hid it in a briefcase when he was asking people questions in Sachs and S. Klein, like a damn John le Carré character. Tinker Tailor Soldier Linguist. He showed it to me in the house on Walnut Street that used to serve as a linguistics lab until recently. And he told me that sometimes it's better to just do something and ask forgiveness later. In the context of a human subject study. He was saying this as a linguist with a career of interviewing people and a long history with the Institutional Review Board at Penn that started before there even was modern IRB, but I was still smart enough to recognize that that was not great advice for me personally, and jumped through all the hoops to get IRB exemptions and so on, and ensure that I didn't record without consent in states that don't have single-party consent laws, and meticulously documented my data. This will be relevant shortly. Spoiler, Mean Girl-style academic politics. But about IRB, if I remember my mandatory training, a modern IRB came into existence about 6 or 7 years after he was running around interviewing people saying, "Please speak into my briefcase." So he literally had to ask forgiveness later. One of the things that came out of his research was that he developed a robust set of skills to get people talking, get people comfortable, and ultimately get people to the point where they would tell an engaging story, often about life and death or moral outrage. He would ask things like, was there ever a time that you thought you were going to die? Or have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? He was originally interested in getting people to let their guards down and speak in their vernacular, their most unguarded way of speaking, when they were focused on an emotionally intense story and not focused on how they were saying every individual word, that is the sociolinguistic monitor. But he quickly also became interested in how we structure those kinds of narratives, and just like how he basically single-handedly invented sociolinguistics, he ended up more or less inventing narrative studies. In his most recent book on that, he said that all truly interesting stories really just boil down to 3 things: sex, death, and moral outrage. The guy was fucking metal. His stepdaughter, the sociologist Alice Goffman, was in the news a while ago for an ethnographic study where other academics who were trying to ruin her career put together that she might have been an accessory to a felony if you read her account in just the right unflattering light and squint a bit. But the willingness to follow an interview, wherever it may take you, is pure Bill. I wasn't surprised. He literally calls it the Ruth principle, which he restates in the surprisingly goyish translation for a trained Yiddishist. Did I mention his advisor was Uriel fucking Weinreich? Anyway, he states the Ruth principle as, "Whither thou goest, I shall follow." He was a great conversationalist. And that's part of what I draw on in my other video for this week, so be sure to check that one out. He used all of that to study vowels to map American accents. In the process, he and others discovered that American accents aren't converging like a lot of people thought they would, but are actually diverging. They basically discovered and analyzed what's now called the Northern Cities Vowel Shift. Another thing that always stuck with me is that he basically saved a guy's life by understanding how vowels work. This guy had been accused of a bombing. There was a phone call with a bomb threat that had actually been recorded, and they claimed that it was the defendant. Bill destroyed the prosecution's case by demonstrating that it couldn't have been that guy because of a subtlety of his accent from the regional variation work. The fact that you could use that knowledge in that way to save someone from prison really stuck with me and shaped some of the work I do today. Linguistics is life and death work. It's just that some linguists don't know it yet. Ultimately, he wrote a 3-volume magnum opus on how language change even happens, called, fittingly, Principles of Linguistic Change. When I studied under Bill, he taught a class on dialectology and mapping regional variation using various linguistic atlases. I noticed that nobody had ever mapped out regional variation in Black English. Bill said it was a tragedy that he couldn't secure additional funding for the telephone survey they did in the 90s. Nobody wanted to fund research into Black accents. In his class, I proposed using geolocated tweets to map lexical variation. This wasn't what we were supposed to do for the class project, but he took a serious interest in it, supported me on it, and it ultimately became my 2015 paper in American Speech, which was accepted without revisions. Academics will know what a big deal that is. Later, I used a modern social media update, since you can't cold call people on a landline now and expect anyone to have a conversation with you, and I used that to do the first ever analysis of regional accents in Black English. If you look for it, you're going to see that Charlie Farrington wrote a dissertation with a very similar name. I don't fault him for that, because making names for dissertations is basically the same as making YouTube thumbnails and titles, and it's a good name. Now, here's the thing. He could have been offended by that. I point out in my dissertation proposal that he and other scholars said in the 1970s that Black English was basically the same everywhere. And then I proceeded to play audio of people from different places and literally map their vowel spaces. Kevin Hart, Ryan Coogler, and so on. You can't tell me these guys sound the same. And to his credit, he supported me as a scholar when I disagreed with him and outright contradicted what he had said 30 or 50 years prior, and what had become dogma in the field, as have many things he said. And his signature is right there on the front of my dissertation, even though one of my chapters disproves his theory about how the northern cities' vowel shift spread. That's because he was always pursuing knowledge, pursuing the truth, and cultivating scholars rather than consolidating his political position and doubling down on defending an opinion. And it's not that he was oblivious to academic politics and backstabbing. Quite the opposite. He was aware, and he combated it. I just learned after his passing that he had evidently hired a lawyer for Anne Charity Hudley to countersue when she was wrongfully sued for something having to do with her research. He went to bat for me twice, and I'm forever grateful. The first was when my co-author and I were falsely accused of academic misconduct and fabricating data. It went from a disgruntled reviewer G, yes, G, that's reviewer 6, to a new submission at another journal, going to the same reviewer, to them claiming it was under review in 2 places at once, to them making a false allegation that the editors of the journal investigated and found baseless, to making an anonymized false allegation to the dean at Penn. And you thought reviewer 2 was bad. Just to give you a taste, in the original review they claimed that nobody in the history of the world had ever referred to themselves as a brother, as in, help a brother out. Meaning, help me out. They suggested that we include scripted material from the Homie D. Clown sketch from the 90s comedy show In Living Color as, quote, authentic Black English. And they claimed that they had secret, unshareable recordings in which the object of academic interest we were studying did not occur, which therefore disproved our analysis. Our revised version of the first journal had to cite John Locke's work from 1620 on, how you even do a science. I know who it was, but I'm not petty enough to make that public. We ended up in front of an investigative panel, a kangaroo court, having to explain that digital field notes, in fact, carry inalterable metadata that prevents tampering, and that such a thing is also, in fact, better than a notepad with notes taken in pencil, which, in fact, can be tampered with. The IT guy they had from the university as a tech consultant got visibly annoyed and frustrated on our behalf. He was the real hero. Kicker is that there was a famous sociologist on the panel whose name rhymes with Hercule Poirot, who subsequently published a book on field methods in very short order. Ultimately, I got a strange 6-page apology and admonishment from the administration to the effect of, you did nothing wrong, and don't do it again. Not only did Bill go to bat for me there, but simultaneous with that, a disgruntled overseer, because that's a real job at UPenn, read about my research in the New York Times, imagined I invented the term African American English, and took offense at painting all African Americans as speaking ghetto slang. I ended up before the tri-chairs of the UPenn Senate explaining that I applied to UPenn because they were already famous for studying African American English, and that Bill Labov had been calling it that for 20 years at that point. He wrote an impassioned letter that he seems to have CC'd more people than strictly necessary on. Linguistics is a toxic enough field that there's an entire book written about how vitriolic and ridiculous it is, and for all the toxic and ridiculous nonsense in the field, Bill was about the ideas, the empirical evidence, and the analysis. I presented a paper in 2015 about a verb of quotation that somehow made me a professional nemesis. It's an asymmetrical relationship, but people won't stop telling me, do you know what Professor X said about you? No, not that Professor X. That would be way cooler, and also he could probably just telepathically trash talk. Anyway, simultaneously, some of his students who were less attentive to the social lessons he taught tried to get me drummed out of an invited working papers collection by going back channel to the editor after publication had been publicly agreed on in Bill's presence. When the editor said they'd tell me and tell Bill, it evidently scared them. You ever have one of those fake-ass conversations that starts with, hey, I don't know what you might have heard, but I just want to see you and the whole rest of the department succeed. And all the while, Bill, on the other hand, just evaluated the evidence and cited the paper when he next wrote about verbs of quotation. I didn't even find out about it from him, just saw it on Google Scholar. I'll link all these controversial papers in the description, by the way, if you want to have a read. And here's the thing, Bill didn't just cultivate and defend me. Nearly everybody I know has a Bill story. Not one about academics, but one where he defended them, or helped them, or in some way changed their life with kindness. Bill was among the first to cultivate and advise scholars who are now somewhat euphemistically called scholars from non-traditional backgrounds. Maybe it's because he had an Ivy League education from a time when the Ivy Leagues restricted Jews. Maybe it's just his strong personal sense of justice and the inherent worth and dignity of all people. But instead of studying Black English with all white scholars, he intentionally cultivated Black scholars, female scholars, speakers of other stigmatized dialects. He recognized that native speakers of, say, Appalachian English are going to have insights that won't occur to a well-trained outsider, and are going to ask better questions and likely be able to answer them. And while the field is still absurdly homogeneous, or homogeneous, depending on which pronunciation you like better. He's done more than just about anybody to change that. If you want to learn more about Bill's work or really dig into his research, there are a handful of relatively accessible books. I'll link them all in the description with an Amazon affiliate link. My first introduction was The Social Stratification of R in New York City English, followed quickly by Language in the Inner City. Both are highly readable and come out of compiling related papers into books. If you're up for a challenge, there's Principles of Linguistic Change. I disagree with a lot in it, and some of the studies leave a bit wanting, like statistical power in particular, but it's a tremendous and very thought-provoking work. And for a completely different side of things, there's The Language of Life and Death, which I cannot recommend enough. In it, he analyzes how we build narratives and how narratives tell the truth, but use linguistic tools to assign praise and blame and to massage the historical facts to suit their personal agendas. The narratives themselves are some of the most interesting stories you've ever read. Bill Labov passed on the 17th of December 2024, or 16 Kislev. I was originally going to release this on the 30-day anniversary of his passing, which corresponds to January 16th, but since the LSA is this weekend, along with a memorial service for invited speakers only, I wanted to add my voice and share his memory with my 150,000 subscribers, rather than a couple thousand linguists at a conference. He lives on not just in the memories of his family, but in all those scholars whose views and whose lives he shaped. I'm not going to do the whole like and subscribe rigmarole here, you all already know it. Bill, you'll be missed. May your memory forever be for a blessing. Until next time, happy learning.